Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined by a special guest that we'll introduce in a moment, but I'm also joined, as I am every week, by my co-host of the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, in the heart of the hurricane, sort of. Richard, good to see you again. I'm glad that you have weathered the storm, so to speak.
It's good to be back in one piece and with a roof over my head.
Yeah, it's good that you got spared the direct hit, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, parts of North Carolina were not so lucky.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Well, we're joined by our special guest, Ted Galen Carpenter, who's been with the Cato Institute, the premier libertarian think tank in the United States for many years. He's a specialist in foreign policy there at Cato. And Ted, it's a great honor to have you here on Libertarian Angle.
Well, thank you, Bumper. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. Really appreciate the chance to see you two again.
Yeah.
And we have, of course, a lot of issues on the international scene. It's not a quiet time.
Yeah, you do a lot of writing, especially on foreign policy, Ted, and I always make it a point to look for your articles and have for many, many years. You're one of my real life heroes here in this area of libertarianism.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Well, give us your overall perspective here about what's going on in the world with respect to libertarianism and foreign policy, the Trump administration. Just kind of put things in an overall context and tell us what you see here.
I think one of the main trends is that the world is changing very rapidly, and U.S. foreign policy either is stale, extremely rigid, or to the extent that it changes at all, it keeps changing in exactly the wrong direction. U.S. leaders are trying to preserve Washington's international dominance under the rubric of U.S. leadership. That's a euphemism for the Pax Americana, the United States trying to micromanage the world. And that didn't work out all that well, even during the Cold War. Since the end of the Cold War, it has made an absolute mess of international affairs. And yet the resistance to changing that policy among the elites in the United States, that resistance is more determined than ever. When Donald Trump made mere noises about some changes in U.S. foreign policy to have the U.S. with a more limited, more restrained role, I'm not sure he meant much of that. But when he simply voiced those sentiments, the elites acted as though this was the greatest threat to American security and liberty one could imagine. What they're trying to do, of course, is preserve their policy preferences and their positions of influence. Trump's rhetoric was deeply threatening to them. And I think that's why we've seen this concerted effort to undermine his presidency in general, and especially any foreign policy initiatives in a more positive direction in particular.
Well, Ted, if I could sort of play devil's advocate and sort of get your take on sort of this wider perspective that you were saying America's dominant role that it has had in the world. Following the Second World War, there was a sort of a consensus view that the world was a dangerous and unstable place, and that for good or ill, in the 19th century and the very early part of the 20th century, Great Britain had been sort of a stabilizing force for world order, an inspiration generally, as well as a military presence with its global empire, to sort of make a messy and dangerous world slightly less messy and dangerous. Then, given the collapse of the British Empire in wealth and ability, that mantle then fell to America. And what would have happened to the world after 1945 if the United States had not formed these alliances in the face of the growing Soviet threat, first under Stalin, had not attempted to be an inspiration and a guidance for what they define as a new liberal economic order after the autarky and protectionism of the 1930s. And that, in fact, while it has not been perfect, you have this enumeration of all the mistakes, errors, abuses, and arrogance, better to have had America imperfectly fill these shoes than the world have been left in a chaos similar to after the First World War. That's the general I've often heard, Ted. And I'd like if the viewers and listeners could hear what you see as a response to that perspective.
It was possible at least to make that argument in a credible manner during the first decade or so after World War II. There was a massive power vacuum in the international system, and there were understandable fears that the world was going to repeat the aftermath of World War I and all the problems that developed as a result of that. And that there was no choice but for the United States to take this leadership role in world affairs. Again, a euphemism for U.S. dominance. Whatever the merits of that argument in the decade or so after World War II, that argument is woefully obsolete today, and it ignores all of the abuses, all of the blunders that Washington has created. I don't think anyone can make a reasonable argument, for example, that what the United States has done in the Middle East over the past 6 to 7 decades has made the Middle East a more prosperous, a more stable, a more peaceful place. Quite the contrary. It seems like every time the United States intervenes through the CIA and its intelligence allies, or with direct military intervention and regime change, nation building missions, Washington has managed to make the Middle East even more violent, even more unstable, even more unfree. So I'm not sure how one can then make the credible argument that U.S. global dominance has been this great benefit. It's more than a few mistakes. The U.S. policy has been marked by both hypocrisy and incompetence. When I hear the term liberal global order, at best, that is an exaggeration. The United States, throughout the Cold War era, and to a large extent since, has backed an assortment of ugly, repressive dictatorships. The United States has undermined liberty in many parts of the world. You can make the case that the U.S. supported liberty in Western Europe. Even that, I think, has some caveats, some asterisks. But when you talk about East Asia, when you talk about South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, that argument is utter nonsense. We have backed tyrants far more than we have backed liberal democratic movements. And it's been a terrible tragedy. Even today, what is the United States doing in the Middle East as its most visible policy? Washington is backing the Saudi coalition that has intervened in Yemen, has caused famine, has caused a cholera epidemic, has committed an assortment of horrid war crimes. And the United States government is a direct accomplice in that kind of mission. That's not supporting a liberal global order. That is utter hypocrisy.
Yeah, Ted, if we go back to the founding of the United States, I think everyone would agree that we had a different kind of federal governmental structure. We had what was called a limited government republic, as compared to what we have today, which people call a national security state, or what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Some people call it the deep state. It consists of a huge military establishment, permanent military establishment, an intelligence force with the power to assassinate people, a secretive surveillance agency like the NSA. So none of this existed for the first 100 years of American history. You had a very small military force, and that was essentially it. There's also the other issue, related issue of foreign interventionism, where the founding principle of that was enunciated by John Quincy Adams in his speech to Congress on the 4th of July was saying, look, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. There's a lot of bad things in the world, dictators, famines, tyranny, but America is not going to send military forces out there to fix these things. Well, everything changes with respect to foreign interventionism. We see that with the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, then onward with Vietnam, Korea. And then after World War II, the federal government changes to a national security state. And so you have this combination of the national security state and foreign interventionism that I even question the legitimacy of this. I mean, if you look at what the CIA was doing with regime change operations in '53, like with Iran, ousting the democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, or Guatemala in '54, or Chile in '73. I mean, the results are nothing to be happy about. And the argument was, well, if the Soviets have this totalitarian structure, the only way we're going to be able to win the Cold War is to adopt the same type of totalitarian structure, because they were a national security state too. Well, Eisenhower points out in his farewell address, this is an alien type of governmental structure. He argued it was necessary. I question that. I think that if you're going to fight an opponent, you stick with your principles, which are freedom and limited government. You don't adopt the principles of the opposing side. And so we see things like MK Ultra, where the CIA is adopting this program of medical experimentation. So after the end of the Cold War, you would expect this whole thing to dismantle. I mean, that was the excuse for constructing it, but instead they start provoking things in the Middle East. They stir up a hornet's nest, Iraq, the sanctions. We get the blowback, 9/11, the USS Cole, and then the whole war on terrorism, which results in what you've been talking about, the total disaster of the Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and we're now in a position of never-ending war, where they're telling us, get used to it, this is the way things are going to be permanently. I don't think things have to be permanent. What do you think?
Well, the national security state that we see now was, I believe, an inevitable result of adopting a global interventionist foreign policy. Why do I say that? Because it's not really possible to run a global empire with a republic based on the principle of limited constitutional authority. You can't do it. You cannot have a minimal government trying to run a global empire. And so what we saw develop was, again, inevitable. The development of a very large, very expensive military that needs to be put to work. It's not just going to sit there. The intelligence apparatus. And that, to me, maybe is the most insidious and damaging result. Because when Eisenhower made his comment about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address at the end of his term in 1961, the intelligence apparatus was still relatively limited compared, certainly, to what we have today. And let's remember, Eisenhower talked about the original formulation, the military-industrial congressional complex. Well, now I think it's the military-industrial congressional intelligence apparatus. That's the complex that we're dealing with now. It is enormously powerful. It is a nest of vested interests with hundreds of billions of dollars at stake and careers for hundreds of thousands of people at stake. Now, you don't just wrap that up with the end of the Cold War and say, well, we won. Now all of you people are going to have to go get other jobs. And oh, by the way, defense contractors, I'm afraid your budgets are going to shrink by 80, 90%. And expect those people to just say, well, the world has changed, and we recognize that, we accept it. Everybody pop the champagne corks. We're as happy as any other Americans about this. No, they're going to fight to protect those entrenched multi-billion-dollar a year vested interests, and they have done so, and they fight dirty. They're not going to abide by constitutional or legal restraints. We've certainly seen that internationally. We're now seeing it to a greater and greater extent domestically.
Well, the counter arguments is that yes, there are many negative side effects of America having to play this role in the world, and it's a difficult balancing act. But that one threat after another emerges, and again, I'd like your take on the following now danger that is argued to be at the horizon, and that is with the new China, Ted. China is, at least in output, considered the second largest economy in the world, behind the United States. President Xi has announced that this one road and one beltway strategy to envelop China's influence and economic presence, the establishment of Chinese foreign military bases in Djibouti and East Africa, manipulating countries like Sri Lanka to take hold of a port facility, like the imperialist countries did in the 19th century with concessions on China itself, like Hong Kong, with long-term leases. So the response, if you read the Wall Street Journal and some of the other conservative literature, is that you may be right about a lot of this, but the next global threat is China as a military power wants to become the new center of the world, and if not America, what shall be done? Those are the arguments that are heard. It's what to say America should follow its principles, but their response, and they're persuasive with the general public, is that what do you do about a son of a country like China that threatens the globe?
One of the problems with that argument is that there will always be some demon figure in the international system to cite as the justification for doing more in the way of U.S. military and security operations in the world. China is the latest candidate for that designation. Global terrorism, which was the most amorphous and guaranteed to be permanent threat, is out there. But I think the U.S. needs to justify its foreign policy the kind of strategic adversary, really big, powerful strategic adversary that the Soviet Union had as its image throughout the Cold War. China, I think, will eventually displace the amorphous global terrorist threat as that primary justification. Terrorism is always going to be there as a fallback option, but China is going to be the new demon, the new villain. The United States existed for many, many decades dealing with a multipolar world where there were lots of powerful countries in the world. We did a pretty good job of protecting our domestic political system, our domestic freedoms in that kind of world. The notion that the only way we can protect our freedoms is by dominating the world. And that really is the implicit argument of the current elite. They don't voice it in that way, but that's the real meaning of their policies. That notion will erode and severely undermine America's domestic freedoms, as well as causing so many problems in world affairs. The United States has a military establishment that is nearly 5 times more expensive than that of any other country. The second place power is, not surprisingly, China. But the U.S. spending is literally in a league of its own. And when you consider all the wars the United States is involved in and has been involved in since it adopted this global interventionist policy, I love the statement that we need to have a policy of peace through strength. The United States has the strongest military, the strongest intelligence establishment in the world by far. Where is our peace? We have had that for decades, all those capabilities, but we do not have the reward of peace or anything even resembling it. Instead, we have constant war. Well, that's not a successful policy.
If I can just follow up with this a little bit, what you're pointing out, that with America's global presence, empire, as some would call it, but those who advocate don't want to use that term, there's obviously been a huge financial drain of tens of hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars since the end of the Second World War. Military conscription, wars that have cost the lives of over 100,000 Americans, if you count Korea and Vietnam and these other adventures we've undertaken. The emergence of reduced freedoms at home, the surveillance state, flying an airplane and the inconveniences that have emerged with that. All of these generic concerns were expressed by other and earlier advocates of liberty. For example, John T. Flynn's As We Go Marching during the Second World War. The historian Arthur Kirch in the 1950s with his book, The Decline of American Liberalism, or The Civilian and the Military. And one can go on and on and on. Why do you think it is that it has been so difficult for the advocates of liberty to successfully persuade their fellow citizens on the emerging threat and the existence of these threats for so many decades? And how do we get this point across effectively to first stop this continuing and then hopefully at some point be able to reverse and eliminate?
What we've seen time and time again is that Americans get scared. Sometimes the threat is genuine, sometimes it is greatly hyped, but they react with that fear by accepting restraints on their domestic freedoms and accepting the logic, temporarily at least, to go abroad to eliminate this terrifying threat. I think increasingly, though, doubts are creeping in with the public. The public is less and less receptive to the notion that, well, the last crusade may have been a disaster. Let's not talk about that. Let's move on to the current threat and the new crusade that we have to launch. War fatigue is definitely setting in, and I think this affords the advocates of liberty an opportunity to challenge the foreign policy status quo, offer an alternative that to the public will be more appealing. One thing I've seen is how out of step the elites are with the general public. The general public does not want to go launch another regime change, nation building war in the Middle East or anywhere else. I think the public, generally speaking, has had it with that kind of crusade. And yet, I would say 80 to 90% of the foreign policy community, and probably more than 90% of the political community, is still on board with that knee-jerk global interventionist policy. We need to work more and more with the public, and I think with academics, with others in the broader foreign policy community that have grown weary of the status quo, that are now really challenging the status quo. There's a better way to deal with the world than what we have done in recent decades. Nobody can contend that what we've done over the last 25, 30 years has made the world a better place or has improved America's position in the world or improved our domestic liberties and prosperity. No credible person can make that argument.
Ted, I'd like to emphasize a couple of points that you've made. One is that this need for official enemies. That it seems that the national security state is always coming up with some big enemy that is threatening the United States, whether it happens to be, Russia, and I think that's part of the heresy that the Trump administration engaged in, at least early on, questioning this whole notion of why Russia needs to be an official enemy. And then there's China, and then there's terrorism. And so there's a matter of hyping, but in some instances, it's also a matter of creating the enemy. For example, after they go into Iraq and invade and effect regime change there, they end up with a new official enemy called ISIS, which they now say, well, is necessary to protect us. So a national security state necessarily depends on having a vast array of official enemies. And the other point that you made, which I find very fascinating and insightful, is this quest to dominate, to rule. Because you often hear people saying, oh, the U.S., it doesn't acquire property overseas. It's not like the British Empire where we have Americans running the show in these countries. But I think it's a different kind of dominance. It's sort of like the Soviet model in Eastern Europe. You try to get your people in public office in these countries that are local people that will then do your bidding. So just as like Trump is trying to get Republicans elected all across the land and governorships and state houses and so forth, and the Democrats are doing the same thing. I think it's that vision, that same vision in overseas conduct, where they're trying to get their people into public office in all these countries, and either through bribery or meddling or invasions or coups, and in the process they make things just an absolute disaster for people over there as well as over here.
I think you're absolutely right on that point. Some scholars have described the U.S. imperial policy as an empire of clients and bases. And I think that's a pretty accurate description. You're right. We're not like the Roman Empire or a lot of other traditional empires that simply took over large areas of land and ruled them directly. That's not the style of the U.S. empire. It is having obedient, quote, allies, usually meaning security dependents and political clients, and that incredible network of military bases around the world in literally dozens of countries. That's how the U.S. elite exercises its power internationally. And in a narrow sense, it has worked. It certainly worked to the benefit of the elites. Is not very good for the American people as a whole. We can certainly confirm that. I mean, just consider the cost of the wars that have been waged since the 9/11 attacks, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Over $4 trillion in direct and indirect expenses. If we had piled that money on the White House lawn and set it aflame, it would have done far less damage to the American people and to the world. It's not just a waste. Were that it was just a terrible $4 trillion waste. Imagine the tax cuts that could have come from that. But it has done such horrible damage in the world, caused such human suffering. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of innocent people who have died in those wars, millions made homeless refugees. That is the benefit of American leadership? Please, I don't think we're going to get thank you notes from people in a lot of those countries.
You know, when the United States under Clinton was intervening in the former Yugoslavia and bombing parts of Serbia, I remember an account in the paper that they were talking about someone whose home had been bombed and whose family had been partly killed. And the fellow says, there is one thing that has come out of this for me now, and that is for the rest of my life, I will hate America.
Yeah. Ted,
And that sentiment is what
I'm afraid
policies.
that's a sentiment that has mushroomed in so many different areas of the world. Amazingly, a lot of people there still make the distinction. They'll emphasize, we don't hate Americans. We don't hate American values, but we hate what the United States government has done. But how long will the majority of people in those regions make that distinction? Increasingly, more and more are not making that distinction.
Ted, you've also done fantastic work in the area of the drug war and specifically on the foreign policy aspect. Can you just, in the waning moments here, give us your synopsis of the drug war?
The good news is that public sentiment in the United States is definitely turning decisively against the war on drugs. We certainly see it with marijuana legalization, but there are other manifestations as well. Unfortunately, internationally, it is still doing a tremendous amount of damage, still causing instability in Mexico. It has made an utter disaster of the Central American countries. It has been a terrible factor undermining any kind of peaceful civil society in Afghanistan. And we could go on and on. The war on drugs has just done a tremendous amount of damage internationally and domestically. We can talk about the massive prison populations in the United States, thanks to the war on drugs. We can talk about the fostering of corruption, the empowering of ruthless criminal drug trafficking gangs in Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere in the world. There certainly is a greater sentiment toward reconsidering that entire strategy. And I think, again, that offers us some opportunities to press the case for liberty. But once again, you have a multi-billion-dollar a year set of vested interests in law enforcement, in the security and intelligence agencies, and so on, that benefit from pursuing this war on drugs. That kind of entrenched interest has to be overcome.
All right. If people want to learn more about Ted Galen Carpenter, well, specifically about the work you're doing, can you tell us about any books you've written, as well as where people would access your continuing articles on these kind of controversies?
I've written multiple books on NATO, but one of the books I'm most proud of is a book that I wrote with a co-author, Malou Innocent, on Perilous Partners, which is Washington's alliances with authoritarian regimes and all the damage that has caused in terms of damage to liberty, both at home and abroad, over the decades. There's also a new book out in a few months, and that is going to be on U.S. relations with so-called foreign democratic movements. Everything from the Kosovo Liberation Army, the Contras, to the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, to the Iraqi National Congress, and how, again, that policy has entangled the United States in so many murky, ugly quarrels, not at all to the benefit of the American people.
And to access your articles, where would people find them?
You can get them on the Cato Institute website, www.cato.org. And there's a whole section on that website of my work, both in terms of articles and studies and books.
All right. Richard, any parting comments here?
Yes, I would just only tell our viewers and listeners that to take advantage of Ted Carpenter's books and his articles. I have been a great admirer and following him for many years. And his is a voice of sanity, reason, and historical perspective on this entire array of foreign policy issues that is very much lacking in the general foreign policy establishment of the United States. There's a lot of wisdom, insight, and history there. take advantage of it, and it will reinforce your understanding of what America has wrought on the world and a more reasonable path for U.S. foreign policy to follow.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you both for giving me an opportunity to be here today.
Yeah, it's not very often that I agree with Richard, but Richard, I agree with everything you just said. Ted, it's been an honor to have you on, a real pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.
All right.
Thank you both.